In the final, chaotic days of World War II, as the Third Reich crumbled, one isolated fortress still held secrets history had nearly forgotten. High in the Austrian Alps stood Castle Itter, a medieval stronghold surrounded by mist and pine. It looked timeless, but inside its stone walls, history's strangest story was about to unfold. For months, this ancient castle had served as a Nazi prison, not for soldiers, but for men of power, France's most elite political and military leaders. Among them were former prime ministers, generals, and athletes, men who once ruled nations now trapped behind bars, waiting for a war's end that refused to come. They dined on scraps, shared thin blankets, and whispered through cold nights about their uncertain fate. The Yards who once obeyed every order now looked lost, their uniforms torn, their loyalty fading as the empire that fed them fell apart. Outside the castle walls, Germany was burning. The Allies pressed from the west, the Soviets from the east, and in between, only ashes and broken men. Hitler's SS, however, still clung to madness. They refused to surrender. They killed anyone who spoke of peace. Each night, the prisoners could hear distant gunfire echo through the valleys, a haunting reminder that freedom and death were racing toward them side by side. Then came one guard, Andreas Krobot, a man torn between duty and humanity. He made a choice that few dared in Nazi Germany, to risk everything for the enemy. Under the cover of darkness, Krobot slipped through the castle gates and disappeared into the woods, carrying only a desperate message. "Help us. The SS will kill them all." For hours, he moved through forests, crawling with retreating German units and Allied patrols, searching for anyone who would listen. Finally, his message reached an unexpected savior. Major John Lee of the U.S. Army, commander of a Sherman tank unit pushing through Austria. That night, fate began to shift. Enemies would become allies, and a forgotten fortress would soon witness one of the most extraordinary battles in all of World War II. As the sun rose over the dying empire, the roads of Austria were filled with chaos. Columns of retreating German soldiers stumbled through mountain passes. Smoke from burning villages drifted through the air, and the thunder of distant artillery never stopped. The once mighty Wehrmacht was now scattered, a ghost of the army that had once conquered Europe. Among this collapse walked a lone figure, Andreas Krobot, a weary German guard from Castle Itter. He carried no weapon, no food, only a desperate letter. He had fled under the cover of darkness, leaving behind the prisoners he had sworn to watch, knowing that if the SS reached them first, not one would survive. Each step he took was a race against time, through forests echoing with gunfire and valleys crawling with patrols still loyal to Hitler's madness. Hours turned into a day. Krobot's boots were torn, his uniform soaked in sweat and mud. He crossed shattered bridges and saw civilians hiding in cellars, praying for the war to end. But to him, there was no end. Not yet. Every mile brought him closer to hope and to danger. Late that afternoon, he reached the outskirts of a small Tyrolean village. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of German voices filled the air. He approached cautiously, hands raised, shouting for help. The men who turned to look were not SS. Their uniforms were faded gray, their helmets dented, their faces hollow. They were regular Wehrmacht soldiers, survivors of a war they no longer believed in. Their commander, Major Josef Gangl, stepped forward. Gangl was a career officer, disciplined, intelligent, and once loyal to the Reich. But the war had changed him. He had seen villages destroyed, civilians executed, and friends shot for refusing insane orders. He no longer saw honor in fighting for a lost cause. When Krobot told him about Castle Itter and the French VIP prisoners inside, Gangl's expression hardened. It wasn't just another story of chaos. It was a chance to do something right, even in the final days of a broken world. That night, Gangl gathered a small group of men he trusted, soldiers who, like him, were done with the SS and the lies of Berlin. Around a flickering lantern, Krobot spread out a rough sketch of the castle and explained the situation. The SS, he said, were regrouping nearby and planning to execute all the French captives before retreating into the mountains. The room fell silent. Then Gangl spoke quietly. "We can't let that happen." There were no cheers, no speeches, just a nod from each man. They knew it was a suicide mission. At dawn, Gangl's small convoy set out. The roads were cracked, littered with debris, and filled with the smell of death. Civilians waved white cloths as they passed, unsure whether to fear them or pray for them. The soldiers wore no insignia now, only dirt and exhaustion. Krobot led the way, guiding them through narrow forest trails to avoid SS checkpoints. Every turn of the road could mean an ambush. Yet, for the first time, these German soldiers felt a strange sense of purpose. They were no longer fighting for a dictator, but for humanity. By midday, they spotted American armor moving near. The village of Kufstein. Sherman tanks and jeeps advancing cautiously through the ruins. Gangl ordered his men to raise white flags. The Americans, surprised, stopped their tanks and aimed their guns. Slowly, Gangl stepped forward, hands raised, shouting in broken English, "Not enemy! We fight SS!" At first, the Americans hesitated. Then, from the lead tank, a man climbed out. Major John C. Lee. He was young, confident, and sharp-eyed. When Gangl told him the story, French prisoners, SS attackers, the desperate need for help, Lee didn't flinch. He simply said, "Show me the way." And so, the impossible alliance was born. American tankers and German soldiers, once sworn enemies, now prepared to fight side by side. They formed a convoy, a single Sherman tank named Besotten Jenny, followed by 2 trucks loaded with a mix of Americans and Germans. It was an image that defied everything the war had stood for. Stars and crosses moving together toward a single cause. As they rolled through the valleys toward Castle Itter, the landscape around them grew darker. Burned-out vehicles lined the roads, the air smelled of gunpowder, and every shadow could hide an enemy. But there was no turning back. That evening, as the convoy neared the castle, the distant peaks glowed orange under a setting sun. The air was still, but heavy with tension. Inside Castle Itter, the French prisoners heard the faint rumble of engines and rushed to the windows. Was it the SS or salvation? In the distance, the Sherman tank climbed the winding road, its engine growling, its turret scanning the tree line. Gangl rode beside Lee, watching the fortress grow larger against the blood-red sky. For the first time, he felt something close to peace. Not because he was safe, but because he knew what he was fighting for. The battle for Castle Itter was about to begin. The convoy finally reached Castle Itter, a gray stone fortress perched on an Austrian hill, surrounded by forest mist and silence. For a moment, everything was still. The Americans parked their Sherman tank near the castle gate, while Gangl's Germans checked the outer walls. Inside, the French prisoners, men who once ruled Paris, peeked nervously through broken windows. Everyone knew the SS could appear at any moment, and that the next few hours might decide their fate. As dawn broke, the prisoners rushed to meet their rescuers. Among them were generals, politicians, and even tennis stars, all captured months earlier by the Nazis. They thanked the Americans and Germans alike, but their relief was short-lived. From the valley below came the faint echo of engines. Dozens, maybe hundreds. The SS was coming. Lieutenant Lee turned to Gangl and said quietly, We hold this place, or we all die here." In haste, the defenders prepared their positions. The Americans set up a .50 caliber on the castle tower. Gangl's men placed rifles along the battlements. Ammunition was scarce, barely enough for a few hours. One German soldier joked bitterly, "First time I shoot at my own uniform." They all laughed, a thin, nervous laugh. Soldiers from opposite sides, now fighting shoulder to shoulder. The first SS trucks appeared around noon. They came firing, bullets striking the stone walls like hail. The Sherman's turret roared, sending shells into the valley, blowing apart trees and metal. Smoke covered the mountainside. One American shouted, "They're coming from the east!" while Gangl ran to reposition his men. The sound of war echoed through the Alps, shaking the air with every explosion. Amid the chaos, Gangl saw civilians crossing the road, villagers trying to flee the battle. Without hesitation, he ran down the open street to help them. A sniper's shot rang out. He fell instantly. The Germans yelled his name, but he was gone. The man who once served Hitler had now died protecting innocent lives and fighting alongside the Americans. It was a sacrifice that would be remembered forever. As the hours passed, the defenders grew desperate. Ammunition ran low. The Sherman tank was hit and immobilized, but the Americans refused to retreat. "Not one step back!" shouted Lieutenant Lee, firing his carbine from the tower window. The French prisoners, armed with captured rifles, joined the fight. Former enemies stood united, firing at the advancing SS. Just when all hope seemed lost, a distant rumble echoed from the west. Allied armor, real reinforcements, had arrived. American tanks rolled into the valley, their guns lighting up the forest. The SS scattered in panic. The castle's defenders cheered as the stars and stripes came into view. The impossible alliance had survived. When the smoke cleared, the castle was a ruin. Walls torn, flags shredded, but the defenders alive. Gangl's body lay where he had fallen, draped in both German and American colors. For a brief moment in history, enemies had fought as brothers. Itter became the only place in World War II where American and German troops fought together, not as foes, but as men standing for what was right. When the final gunshot faded, an unnatural silence fell over Castle Itter. The echoes of battle had vanished, leaving only smoke, shattered walls, and the smell of gunpowder in the cold morning air. Soldiers, both American and German, stood together among the ruins, their faces pale and exhausted. The war outside still raged, but here, in this small Austrian valley, peace had come at a terrible cost. They found Major Josef Gangl lying near the village road, his rifle beside him, his eyes open toward the mountains. No one spoke. Lieutenant Lee knelt beside him and whispered, "You did good, soldier." The German men saluted him, not as an officer, but as a comrade. Even the French prisoners wept quietly. In that moment, nationality meant nothing. Humanity did. The fortress that had once imprisoned generals now stood as a symbol of freedom. Walls were torn, windows shattered, the flagpole broken. But among the destruction, there was pride. Pride that this ancient stone had become the last stand of honor in a world gone mad. A French prisoner wrote in his journal, "Here, enemies found brotherhood." As Allied reinforcements secured the area, the defenders prepared to part ways. The Germans, now prisoners themselves, handed over their weapons peacefully. One American soldier offered them cigarettes, saying, "You earned it." They shared a smoke under the rising sun, the same men who would have killed each other a week ago. When the war ended days later, Castle Itter's story barely reached the headlines. The world was too busy celebrating victory and counting losses. Reports were filed, medals were awarded quietly, and the names of those who fought together faded into dusty archives. Only those who were there truly understood what had happened. Weeks after the battle, Lieutenant Lee wrote a letter to his wife in America. It read, "I fought with Germans, against Germans. Strange war, honey, but maybe that's how peace begins." His words captured the surreal beauty of that alliance, a brief, flickering moment of unity before the Iron Curtain would divide the world once more. Years passed. The castle stood quiet again, reclaimed by ivy and wind. Visitors rarely came, unaware that within these stone halls once echoed the strangest alliance of the war. A single plaque marked the event, small, almost forgotten. But those who read it always paused a little longer, imagining the courage that had lived there. Today, Castle Itter stands not as a relic of war, but as proof of something far greater, that even in darkness, humanity can prevail. The story of Americans, Germans, and Frenchmen fighting side by side defies every narrative of hate. It reminds us that courage, compassion, and sacrifice can rise even from the ashes of the world's darkest hour. Josef Gangl had been a soldier long before he became a hero. Born into a Germany that worshipped order and obedience, he rose through the Wehrmacht ranks, believing in loyalty above all. But as the war dragged on, the things he saw began to fracture that belief. Entire villages wiped out, families executed for rumors of rebellion, and officers who spoke of duty as they watched children starve. The world he had pledged himself to no longer made sense. Every command felt heavier than the last, and Gangl began to realize that obedience without conscience was just another kind of death. By 1945, the Reich was crumbling, but the SS still demanded total faith. Their slogans echoed in empty towns, while men like Gangl saw only smoke and graves. His men no longer looked at him as a commander, but as someone who might understand their fear. In his diary, he wrote, "The war we fight now is not for Germany. It is for madness." That was the moment the flag lost its meaning. Gangl stopped saluting symbols and began listening to his own humanity. The breaking point came in the mountains of Tyrol. There, Gangl watched SS troops round up villagers accused of treason. Among them, women, the elderly, even a boy carrying bread. He could have looked away. Instead, he acted. Quietly, he ordered his men to escort the villagers out under the pretense of interrogation, then set them free. From that day on, he knew there was no going back. He became a silent traitor to tyranny, protecting those he once swore to control. In late April, Gangl learned that French VIP prisoners, politicians, generals, and artists were trapped inside Castle Itter. SS units were preparing to execute them before retreating. Gangl had no illusions left. He gathered a handful of loyal soldiers and made a decision that would define his life. He would save them. Carrying a white flag, he drove through enemy lines to meet the Americans. When he reached Lieutenant John Lee, the two men, one from the Reich, one from the United States, stared across the gun barrels. Then slowly, Lee extended his hand. That handshake was history's quiet rebellion. As dawn approached, Americans and Germans rode side by side toward Castle Itter, a single Sherman tank leading the way through narrow mountain roads. The air was thick with fog, but Gangl's mind was clear. He knew what awaited him, an army of SS fanatics, outnumbering them 10-1. Still, he smiled faintly as the castle came into view. For the first time in years, he was fighting not for orders, but for something he believed in. When the SS attacked, it was as if hell itself had risen from the valley. Bullets tore through stone walls, explosions lit the sky, and screams echoed through the fortress. Gangl fought with fearless precision, commanding both his men and the Americans with calm urgency. When he saw villagers caught in the crossfire, he didn't hesitate. He sprinted down the open street to rescue them. A sniper's shot rang out. One heartbeat later, he fell. The man who had once worn the uniform of tyranny died saving the innocent. His blood became the final flag raised that day. When the battle ended, the Americans buried Gangl with honor. The French prisoners wept. One of them said, "He died for us, not as a German, but as a man." But in post-war Germany, his story was inconvenient. A Nazi officer who became a hero didn't fit any narrative. His name vanished from records, and history moved on. Yet in the small Austrian town where he fell, villagers remembered. Each year, they placed flowers on the road, whispering his name like a secret prayer. Josef Gangl. Decades later, historians rediscovered the Battle of Castle Itter and the truth about its unlikely alliance. Gangl's name returned, first in books, then in documentaries, and finally on a small street sign in Wörgl, Josef Gangl Straße. Today, it stands as a symbol of moral courage, proof that even in the darkest times, light can still rise from within the enemy's ranks. Gangl didn't win a war, but he defeated something greater, the part of himself that once obeyed without question. That victory will never fade. The guns have long been silent, yet if you stand before Castle Itter today, the wind still carries whispers of that impossible morning. Its cracked walls and bullet-pocked gates are not ruins. They are witnesses. They remember the day when enemies stood shoulder to shoulder, not in hatred, but in humanity. Each scar in the stone is a heartbeat frozen in time, a memory of men who defied flags, orders, and fear itself. The silence here isn't peace, it's respect. It's as if the earth itself refuses to let their courage fade. When the war ended, chaos replaced clarity. Nations celebrated victory, generals claimed glory, and politicians drew borders with ink still wet from blood. In that noise, the story of Itter vanished, buried beneath propaganda and pride. The Americans returned home as heroes. The French were hailed as survivors. But Josef Gangl's sacrifice and the alliance that defied logic became a footnote no one wanted to explain. After all, how do you tell people that a Nazi officer died saving French captives alongside Americans? History wasn't ready for that kind of truth. Years turned into decades. Grass grew over the old trenches, and children played where soldiers once fell. Locals remembered pieces of the tale, rumors of a strange battle, of German and American uniforms mixed together, but no one spoke too loudly. In post-war Europe, silence was safety. Yet, deep down, the people of Tyrol kept the legend alive. Each generation passed it down in whispers, and every May morning, a few villagers still left wildflowers at the roadside cross where Josef Gangl fell. They didn't need history books. Their hearts remembered for them. It wasn't until the 1970s that researchers began to uncover fragments of the story, faded documents, forgotten diaries, and photographs hidden in dusty archives. The truth that emerged shocked historians. The Battle of Castle Itter wasn't just a skirmish. It was a moral rebellion, a story of soldiers who chose conscience over command and humanity over hate. Slowly, the forgotten tale began to surface, its light piercing through decades of neglect. The name Josef Gangl appeared once again, this time not as an enemy, but as a symbol of redemption. Interviews with the few survivors brought the story to life again. American veterans recalled how Gangl refused to hide during the fight, insisting he protect civilians. French prisoners remembered the moment they saw German troops fighting for them, not against them. One of them, a writer named Paul Reynaud, said, "That day, I saw the world turn right side up again." In those words lay the essence of Itter, a glimpse of what humanity could be if courage triumphed over ideology. Today, the story of Castle Itter stands as a mirror to our own time. In a world still divided by flags and fear, the battle reminds us that good and evil are not bound to uniforms. They live in choices. The image of Josef Gangl, standing beside American troops with his rifle ready, tells us that redemption is never too late. Even a man once trapped in darkness can become the light others follow. And that light, born on a single day in May 1945, still burns quietly in the heart of Europe. Castle Itter still stands, scarred yet unbroken. Tourists wander its halls unaware, that beneath their feet lies one of the strangest battlefields in history. But sometimes, on misty mornings when fog blankets the valley, the villagers say you can hear faint echoes of gunfire and the low rumble of a Sherman tank crawling up the mountain road. The ghosts of Itter are not restless. They are guardians. They remain not to haunt, but to remind, to whisper to those who listen that bravery does not wear one uniform, it wears all of them. As the camera fades to black, imagine this: a lonely mountain road at sunrise, a small wooden cross by the roadside and carved into it, a single name, Josef Gangl. The light touches it softly, like a salute from heaven. The war that once divided millions could not divide the men of Itter. Their story belongs not to one nation, but to all of humanity. And as long as someone remembers it, the legacy of Castle Itter lives on, not as a war story, but as a promise.